Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to this CERES event. And we are partnering with the International Tax and Investment Center, and we're obviously celebrating their report, Future Calling Infrastructure Development in Central Asia. I'm Angell, Stent. I'm director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, and I'm really delighted to welcome Ambassador Kazykhanov. We are very privileged that this is the second time that he has spoken at a CERES event this year, and I'm sure not too many institutions are lucky enough to have you speak twice with them. So we're very, very happy that you could come here today, and we thank you. I know it's been a very busy day. So I'll just give the ambassador a short introduction. Prior to his current appointment, he was Kazakhstan's ambassador to the United Kingdom. And in 2012, he assumed the position of the Assistant to the President of the Republic of Kazakhstan and Minister of Foreign Affairs for Kazakhstan in 2011. And he has served previously to that as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and as Ambassador of Kazakhstan to Austria. So we're delighted to welcome you, and we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. And I would like to start by thanking Center for Eurasian and Russian and Eastern European Studies of Georgetown University for hosting this afternoon in a warm and very friendly atmosphere. I also would like to take this opportunity to welcome my friends, thank my friends Witt and Ariel, Cohen, and also for the and James Grant for the very important report that is entitled Future Calling Infrastructure Development in Central Asia. And I think it's a very timely report and fully relevant to the topic that we are planning to discuss today. I would like to start by saying that this month actually, we are marking 27th anniversary of independence of Kazakhstan, and not too many people know that it was on a Christmas day in 1991, that 25th of December, when the United States officially recognized independence of Kazakhstan. And the first week of January, it was the United States, the first foreign country to open its embassy in Almaty. And a week later, a big airplane landed in Almaty, and there was a first foreign dignitary to visit independent Kazakhstan. It was James Baker, then Foreign Secretary of the United States, sent to Kazakhstan by late President Bush 41. And I would like to take this opportunity also to express our sincere condolences to the people and government of the United States. President Bush was a close friend of my president, and he was the first US president to recognize independence of Kazakhstan, and he been helping building a strong and vibrant Kazakhstan as we are today. And but coming back to the point, I would like to give a kind of general overview who we are, and what we are doing. And by saying so, I would like to say that Kazakhstan has always been inhabited by nomads, as you know, for many centuries, and our ancestors were traveling great steppes. They lived in yurts open to the four winds, and whenever a traveler would come across a single yurt standing in the middle of the steppe, he would be welcomed by the host, no matter who he was, and offered food and some shelter. And only on the third day, the traveler's stay, he would be bothered by the question. So it shows that hospitality, open-mindedness sits deep in our hearts and minds. And so with this spirit, we gained our independence, as I mentioned, in 1991, and it was easier for us to enable market economy and to become a responsible member of global community. 5 years ago, President of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, put forward a very ambitious goal, declaring that Kazakhstan should join the ranks of 30 most developed nations in the world. We looked around, who are those 30 most developed nations, and we understood that all of them are members of the OECD. So that we knocked the doors of the OECD and said, can we be a members of your club? And but in order to become a member of this club, we were told that we need to fulfill a few requirements. So, and since then we embarked on a very ambitious reform process, and the new roadmap of countries' development focuses on industrialization, further unfold our resource potential, use smart technologies, development of agricultural sector, increasing efficiency of transportation and logistics infrastructure, reloading financial sector, and strengthening human capital. As a result, we managed to secure a stable GDP growth around 4% this year, and with non-resource-based sectors contributing almost 2/3 of this growth. Kazakhstan ranks 28 out of 190 countries in the recent World Bank Doing Business report, proving to be an attractive trade and investment destination. US is traditionally the biggest investor in Kazakhstan, with total investment exceeding $45 billion, mainly into the resource sector, as you are very well aware. Only last year, American companies invested $3.7 billion, and their interest continued to grow, reaching 2.8 billion USD just for the first half of this year. We also pay special attention to development of agriculture. In fact, agricultural sector, we see it as an untapped potential. We currently use only 30% of our arable lands. We want to double the size of those lands, and with the 24 million hectares of arable lands and 188 million hectares of pastures, and close proximity with Russia, Central Asia, and Chinese markets, Kazakhstan's agricultural potential has enormous capacity, and we already established a very good cooperation with many of our neighbors. And I would like to take this opportunity to tell you that in September we had a visit of Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Agriculture of Kazakhstan to the United States. He had an excellent meeting with Secretary Perdue, Department of Agriculture, and a number of CEOs of US companies, and he visited Minneapolis. We met a lot of companies, organized a round table. I give you a small example. Over the 20 years, we bought around 20,000 combiners from John Deere, and we plan to increase that number. And we airlifted about several thousand black Angus's from North Dakota. You can imagine that when I was there, it was blizzard in North Dakota, in Bismarck, and when the cows were loaded on the airplanes, FedEx airplanes, and one airplane can feed 186 cars. So, and then 12 hours later, when they were landing in northern Kazakhstan, it was blizzard in northern Kazakhstan, so they barely noticed the difference. But they are feeling themselves very, very well and comfortable, very comfortable. And so we are trying to create a conducive investors climate, and for that we opened an agency that we call Kazakh Invest Agency, which is serving as a one-stop shop for foreign investors. And this agency opened their offices in 10 countries around the world, including the United States, and we have a representative of Kazakh Invest also working, based in Washington, working very close with our embassy, and I'm sure he's present here in this room. So some of you who is interested, you can talk to him. I would like also to mention that our annual trade turnover between two countries this year will reach the number of 2 billion, and showing the significant increase despite the overall economic declining scenario in our part of the world. In October 2018, U.S. Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross led one of the largest trade mission to Kazakhstan to meet President, Prime Minister, members of the cabinet and business community. It was a very important visit aimed at further developing mutual beneficial cooperation in a wide number of areas. And I had the pleasure to accompany Wilbur Ross. Wilbur Ross said he's very much interested in cultures, traditions and cuisine. So the Prime Minister invited him to the Kazakh restaurant, and we had a walking lunch in a Kazakh restaurant that is called Kazakh Gourmet, and I recommend all of you to visit that restaurant whenever you're in Astana. And Secretary Ross said that he liked very much beshbarmak and kurda. And he said, where you can find beshbarmak in Washington? I said, only in my residence. But we are very much looking forward that sooner or later we will be able to open a good Kazakh restaurant in Washington, D.C. Yes, being a full-fledged member of WTO since 2015, we been working very closely with this organization, and I would like to inform you that Kazakhstan will host the MC12 Ministerial Conference of the WTO in Astana in 2020, which I think is very important, will be a very important conference. And you know that with all these trade wars that are taking place around the world, and we think that the meaning, the importance of this organization becoming more and more in focus, and now we are already very actively participating in talks, negotiation process on WTO reform. There are two proposals, one proposal put forward by European Union, the other one by Canadians, but we hope that by 2020 we will be able to come up with good consensus decision in Astana. As a practical step to help American businesses to visit Kazakhstan, we established a free visa regime for the citizens of the United States, similarly to another 52 countries around the world. So Americans, no visa, 30 days. We are opening Consulate General in San Francisco, and I hope it will be operational as of first quarter of the next year. And so we're also signing an open sky agreement between Kazakhstan and the United States, thus enabling direct flights between our countries, hopefully in coming future. It's only 12 hours flight between Astana to New York, and I hope that during my tenure I will be one of the first passengers using this air connection. Yeah, few words about the human capital. As I said, we see the human capital as our biggest asset. And 25 years ago, Kazakhstan government launched an education program that is called Bolashak, and in English it's translated as future. We have been sending students abroad to study at 100 top universities around the world, including Georgetown University. Angela, I'm sure you know many of the Kazakh students who proud graduates of Georgetown, and now we have
my best student is from Kazakhstan.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that.
A young lady.
So now we have more than 20,000 graduates living and working in Kazakhstan. Some of them are ministers, governors, CEOs of big companies, and I think it's a great asset for our country. We understand that English language provided us a better access to modern technologies and innovations. So 5 years ago, we set ourselves a goal to become a trilingual society. Kazakh is a state language. Russian is the language of inter-ethnic communication, and English is the third language now compulsory as a first grade of elementary school. And we have even more ambitious goal. We plan to start a subject level English language teaching as of 1st January next year. We now providing a vocational training for English language teachers in Kazakhstan. The biggest challenge is rural areas of the country, and so we are training now about 12,000 teachers, and the goal is 36,000. We approaching our friends in the United States, State Department, USAID, and other agencies, asking to provide us assistance and support, because US is the biggest English-speaking country in the world, and I think that we already receiving a good understanding and cooperation, and that this has been also discussed yesterday and today during the annual consultations between the State Department and the Foreign Ministry of Kazakhstan. You know that we have a visit of Deputy Assistant Secretary Alice Wells. She's currently in Astana, and she had a day-long consultations today with her counterpart, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I already heard that it was a very, very successful talks that they had in Astana. Well, to provide better access to computer knowledge, we converted our alphabet from Cyrillic to Latin, and I give you a little excursus to the history that before 1926, Kazakhstan used Arabic script. Between 1926 and 1940, we used a Latin script in our language, and between 1940 and 1918, we used the Cyrillic. So by converting back to Latin, we're coming back to our roots, but we think that it will help us to, let's say, provide better access to computer technologies and sciences and knowledges. Human capital is our national asset, as I said before. That is why we plan to increase investment into education by 10% of GDP, and that was officially announced by the President in his State of the Nation address at the beginning of October this year. OECD rules require to limit government ownership in the economy to 15%. That is why we embarked on ambitious privatization campaign. Major blue chip companies, national companies in the sphere of oil and gas, uranium production, air and land transportation, telecommunication, etc., are being listed on international stock exchange. And I'm sure you heard about the recent transaction when we sold a share of our Kazatomprom company last month, and I think that is the beginning. Some of you mentioned the name of the governor of newly established Astana International Financial Center, a good friend of mine, Mr. Kelimbetov, Kairat Kelimbetov, and so Astana Financial Center has been established to serve as a trading and financing platform for foreign and domestic investors. We are building a new financial hub halfway between financial centers like Hong Kong, Singapore on one side and Dubai on the other side of the planet. For that, we created a conducive environment by providing conditions guaranteeing exterritorial status. The financial center operates based on English common law, English language, free visa regime, open sky policy, independent financial regulations. Exterritorial status was the most difficult decision because it entailed to impose some amendments into the constitution of our country. So we went that far to create this financial center. For many centuries, as you know, Kazakhstan been a part of the Great Silk Road. And the Silk Road passed through the territory of Kazakhstan, connecting China and Europe. But there were no instances when of Chinese merchants traveling all the way to Venice and Europeans selling their products in Shanghai. All the trading was happening somewhere in the middle, meaning in Central Asia. We used to have caravanserais, similar to modern days 4, 5, 6 stars hotels. And so today we are working hard to revive this concept by building infrastructure, logistics, and we have been doing this since the first day of our independence, investing billions and billions of dollars into the construction of the railroads, motor roads, renovating airports, building a new seaport. If you remember, during the Soviet time, all the roads were aimed from south to north, because all the roads ended up in Moscow. But so that is why we were we had a very challenging task of connecting east and west of the country, and because there were no connection between east and west. But now we are lucky; we built thousands and thousands of kilometers of railroads and motor roads connecting east and west of the eastern and western borders of Kazakhstan. And in 2013, President of China, Xi Jinping, paid an official visit to Kazakhstan. He was invited by President Nazarbayev, and he also, during the visit, he gave a lecture at one of our leading universities in Astana, and in his speech, in his lecture, he first mentioned this famous initiative that we know now called as Belt and Road Initiative. So not too many of you know that Belt and Road started in Astana. And this initiative came into agreement with what we've been doing for so many years already. And it was, it matched with the long-standing goal that we have to make Kazakhstan a land bridge between east and west. Our own infrastructural program that I mentioned earlier, we call it Nur-Lejol, the bright path. And as I said, we invested a lot of money into that program. And now we are working with China, joining our hands in building infrastructure. I give you one interesting example. We built a so-called dry port right on the border between China and Kazakhstan. This is a new concept where the two countries decided to cut pieces of land from both sides, make it a free economic zone, putting a lot of warehouses there. And now more and more companies are interested to use this dry port, and this dry port is now being managed by one of the biggest port authority company, which is called DP World. This is the first experience of DP World to run the dry port. So I remember I was telling you about this caravanserais along the Silk Road. So I think this is one of the caravanserais that we are trying to revive. And Kazakhstan and its international partners, including China, are benefiting from infrastructure projects. Kazakhstan already accounts for 70% of transit traffic between China and Europe. Experts estimate that by 2020, 5,000 trains will be traveling along the routes, and more than half of them will be passing through the territory of Kazakhstan. By 2020, we also expect that the shipment of transit goods will increase up to 2.5 million containers crossing Kazakh territory. Last year, we had around 1,700 container trains. The land bridge route takes only 2 weeks, while the maritime route takes about 44-45 days. It's not only about the distance, it's all about the money. It's about whether the companies the banks are prepared to freeze their money for 2 weeks or for 45 days. That is the question. And I think that we will continue focusing on the transit potential of Kazakhstan in this respect. Kazakhstan is a landlocked country, has always valued cooperation with our neighbors. We have embarked on a mission of regional integration. Some people say that this is a famous phrase saying that the new winds of change is blowing in Central Asia. Only united 5 Central Asian states can face the threats and challenges in the region. And today our leaders meet much more frequently. We had last Central Asian summit that Central Asian summit that took place in March this year in Astana, bringing together 5 Central Asian leaders. We haven't had this similar summit since long ago, and opening the summit, my president said that nobody knows Central Asia better than we do, and we think that this format is becoming more and more promising. The next summit will take place in March in Tashkent. That has been already agreed, and I already assume that many of you are asking why March. Why March this year? Why March next year? Because Nowruz is the month when we celebrate the New Year, so that it's a good chance to get together for the leaders and then to celebrate the Nowruz festival. Our inter-regional trade in Central Asia constitutes only 8%, which is not fair. We think that we can do better, and for that, the existing formats of cooperation between Central Asia and the United States, namely C5+1, TIFA, Trade and Investment Framework Agreement, we believe can help us to facilitate better trade and investment cooperation in the region. Afghanistan. It's another issue. We believe that Afghanistan not only a source of instability in the region, but also a country with a huge economic potential. We see the nexus between security and development. Kazakhstan for many years has been contributing significantly to peace and rehabilitation of Afghanistan. We have supported international community in their efforts to peacefully resolve the Afghan problem. A special role in this process played by Afghani women, and I would like to mention that this September this year we convened a regional conference on empowering women in Afghanistan. We had a very representative delegation from European Union, United States, and it proved to be a very good conference. Bringing more focus on girls' education. There was a sizable delegation from Afghanistan headed by Minister of Labor and also a large group of Afghan women entrepreneurs. And we also brought delegations from all 5 Central Asian countries. And I think we understand more and more responsibility of the region vis-a-vis Afghanistan peaceful settlement. And I think that these meetings will continue, and we plan already to convene another conference next year on this issue. We're also providing financial support to Afghan National Security Forces. We provide scholarships for Afghani students. Thousands of Afghani students are studying in Kazakhstan these days, and we will continue this program as well. We also have some interest in being involved in railroad construction in Afghanistan. I'm sure you heard about that, but again, it will much depend on security situation in this country. And moreover, we're providing land transit of goods to the coalition forces in Afghanistan through the famous Northern Distribution Network. Finally, being a responsible member of the international community, Kazakhstan, as you remember, 2 years ago, has been elected as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, the only UN body responsible for maintaining peace and security. We've been working very close with US delegation and the Security Council. It was very challenging task for us, and given the international situation, the number of problems that exists around us. But in this role, we deployed 120 peacekeepers in southern Lebanon in the mission, a UNIFIL mission, under the auspices of Indian contingent. And this is the first ever peacekeeping contingent from Central Asia that has been deployed abroad, and specifically in southern Lebanon. And I would like to say that it wouldn't be possible without training and support from US partners. And just 2 days ago, I came from Arizona. I've been invited by Arizona National Guard to mark the 25th anniversary of close cooperation between Arizona National Guard and Kazakhstan Department of Defense. So with this responsibility, we strive to become an epicenter of peace and prosperity in our region, open to the rest of the world. Thank you very much, and we will continue with the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very informative and wide-ranging speech. So I'd like to ask the panel to come. Dan, what? I'd like to ask the panel to come sit here. Yeah?
Please, please. Yeah, the panel can come up. We can do it all.
Good.
Yeah. Before the panel. Okay, that's fine.
Okay. Wait, the panel can come up. Let's move. The fewer movements, the better. Well, Mr. Ambassador, that it's just a remarkable story, the development of Kazakhstan by every dimension. I mean, you think about how the people are better off today than they were 10 years ago. And for gosh sake, since 1991, it's a dramatic story. But I've just returned from 2 weeks in Africa and was singing the praises of Kazakhstan as a model of development to Mozambique. And I'll touch on that as I share a few introductory remarks this afternoon. But Angela, it's a pleasure to be here at Georgetown University, and I think we're going to have a very timely and interesting discussion as we talk about the title as you see on the slide. But Angela, thank you for hosting us, and one of the greatest joys of serving on the Eurasia Board of Trustees together has been getting to know you. And we're going to miss you, but I hope you'll still be coming to some of our dinners. And Ariel, I think with us moving around the world and often different places at different times, this is the first event where we've shared the microphone, and I want to welcome you to ITIC. We're delighted to have you a part of our family, and the energy growth and security program that you're leading is just a wonderful fit to bring together so many pieces of ITIC's work around the world. And today's paper by Ariel and James Grant will provide a foundation, but hopefully not a limit, but a foundation for today's discussions. Now, I'm not going to go into the paper. I'm hoping you've read it, and I wouldn't dare try to infringe on Ariel's turf. But I would like to just say the paper illustrates a unique and unprecedented convergence of project opportunities, the demand side, with project finance, the supply side. And I think this can be a real game changer. Now, having worked in many countries around the world, starting in Kazakhstan that are rich with oil, gas, and minerals, I frankly get tired of hearing the fear-mongering and the oversimplified argument that minerals are a curse. As I said, I was in Mozambique last week. They've got giant gas fields. 3 projects going forward. In 10 years' time, they could have greater LNG production than Qatar. But they are not. They are not destined to become another Nigeria of Africa. Yes, it is a risk, but it comes down to their people and the fiscal and revenue management systems they put in place. Look, we all know it with our own lives. People need rules, especially when you're around large amounts of money. Now, is there anyone from the Norwegian embassy here? We've seen the Norwegians running around the world, NORAD, they preaching transparency like religious missionaries. And that's well and good, but I think few places on earth are going to be like Norway. And I encouraged the Revenue Authority, and the Ministry of Energy in Mozambique, that they need to look at Kazakhstan. They need to look at Azerbaijan and the path that you've traveled on for the past 25 or 30 years. With today's technology and the pools of capital, maybe they can get there in 10 years. But the experiences, and make no mistake that your people are better off because of the way you have welcomed. First, you've welcomed, and you've, in a very wise fiduciary way, have managed those resources. And by every single measure imaginable, your people are better off. And the same arguments we often hear about infrastructure, particularly infrastructure that is stimulated or made possible by external financing. That could be a curse. It could be a white elephant. But I don't think we need to fear the Belt Road Initiative. We must proceed with caution. We must proceed with our eyes open. We must proceed in a competitive way to ensure that financing from China, that those projects are on competitive market terms. But on the face of it, we should not conclude that it will be a China invasion, saddling countries with useless projects for which they'll never be able to pay back the debt. The kind of stuff that makes good headlines, but often do not reflect reality. And as we'll talk about further today, this is going to require the soft infrastructure to go with the hard infrastructure. The right legal, regulatory, and fiscal infrastructure will be needed. There must be competitive terms for the debt, and there must be fiscal control mechanisms put in place so governments will have the future capacity to repay the debt. Just look at Ghana. Before they took those loans in 2008 and 2009, the Minister of Finance went to Parliament and put together a segregated fund to ensure they would always have the capacity to repay those loans. And most importantly, I believe the rules and the terms for each of these projects must be transparent, and transparency will lead to competitiveness. And just let me close with a plug for what somebody asked me last week. Working in the Eurasia space, what did I think was one of the most exciting developments, good or bad? I tend to focus on the good in 2018. And I concluded that was the launch of the Astana International Financial Center on 1 July. And it's more than a financial hub. It boosts a diverse and forward-looking structure. It's a capital market. It's a green finance center. It's a fintech center. It's an asset management center. And it's an Islamic finance center. And all of this is under a unique and protected framework that the ambassador touched upon, a framework that rivals any opportunity zone or free enterprise zone we're talking about here in the United States. And I find it particularly refreshing in today's world of closing markets and protectionism. This is a model of free market openness that I hope the rest of the world can emulate. Thus, we have an exciting discussion ahead today, and I'd like to ask our packed audience, first off, thank you all for coming, but please get ready with your questions. It is our hope that this will be an interactive session with the flow going both ways. We welcome your questions, and again, thank you for being with us, and Angela, thank you for welcoming us here. Thank you.
So I will just now introduce the other members of the panel. Thank you very much, Dan Witt, for your very spirited speech. I must say both my colleague, Professor Theodore Moran, and I were at the opening of the Astana International Financial Center, and it was indeed a very, very impressive ceremony, very impressive conference we had there, and so we all hope it works very well. So
and
just,
we ate well.
Of course we ate well. Don't want to make people too envious here. So obviously we have Ambassador Kazykhanov there. Then sitting next to him is Dr. Ariel Cohen, who is a senior fellow in the International Tax and Investment Center and director of their Energy Growth and Security Program. And he is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Then, of course, we have Dan Witt, who just spoke, who's the president of the International Tax and Investment Center, which produced this report they're just going to discuss. And then we have Kenneth Angell, who's the managing director, project finance of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. We have Jayne, who's the senior energy advisor at the U.S. Agency for International Development, their Asia Bureau. We have Johannes Linn, who is I know that you're a senior non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. You're a resident scholar in the Emerging Markets Forum, but I always enjoy discussions with him at Brookings. And then, of course, my colleague, Professor Theodore Moran, who is a professor in the Wall School of Foreign Service, and he holds the Marcus Wallenberg Chair in International Business and Finance. And I have to say, a number of the students in our MA program here take a certificate in International Business Development, which is run by Professor Moran. And a number of our Central Asian students have done that and then hope to go back to their country of origin. The last one who did it was a Kazakh student, very good student, and apply their knowledge there. So I believe you would like to make some introductory remarks,
Well,
Ted, and then I guess we'll go round with remarks.
I'm just going to tell one story before I turn the role over to Ariel. So I had the good fortune to have Karat Kalambetov as a student here. And then he went back to become governor of the central bank and now chairman of the Astana Financial Center. But we have kept in touch because one of the areas that I do work in is investment promotion and attracting new investments to diversify economies, which is one of the goals of Kazakhstan. So I have been working with Kazakh Invest and going back and forth, working on agriculture without a great deal of success yet, but we're hoping. Working on fintech with a lot of success, and here's the point of my story. Two of our most successful investment attractions have been GE Locomotives, which has formed a joint venture, and Alstom Locomotives, which has formed another joint venture and are actually using an investment zone to build locomotives and to help the process that you referred to of eventually having a high-speed rail network east to west across Kazakhstan. So locomotives, that's the point of my story. So Ariel, let me turn it over to you, and please lead us off.
Thank you so much, Professor Moran. I want to thank Angela Stent, who was a guiding light throughout my career. It's scared to say how long that career is already lasting, but she was a huge presence when I was a graduate student. I want to thank Dan Witt for initiating the Energy Growth and Security Program at his terrific enterprise, the International Tax and Investment Center. Dan, when you're in this country and not flying around the world, it's always a pleasure to be in your company. And I definitely want to thank James Grant. James, please stand up. James co-authored and led the effort on the report and also on organizing two very successful events, one at the Atlantic Council and one here. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start with looking at Belt and Road. Belt and Road is not something that was invented yesterday or even in 2015 when Xi Jinping came to 13. It was invented over 2,000 years ago, and we all read about the contact between Rome and China and Marco Polo and all that. So the infrastructure arises at a new level, to paraphrase Marx and Engels, or Hegel, whoever said that contradictions arise at a new level. And infrastructure, we look at it in two tiers. The first tier is the hard infrastructure, is brick and mortar, iron, railroads. You mentioned locomotives. Before the Bolshevik Revolution, I think there was no railroad in today's Kazakhstan. When the Bolsheviks took a census in 1921, I think, before they built the Turksiv, the Turkestan-Siberia Railroad, they found that in today's Kazakhstan, only 3% of the population was what they classified as proletariat. 3%. The nomads that the ambassador talked about, a lot of them were illiterate. And then, in their great wisdom, the communists went and killed off the educated elite of Central Asia. The movement that was called the Jadid movement, educated, moderately Islamic, some socialist people who were in the leadership positions into the 30s when they were killed. And by the way, my grandfather, who was a newspaper editor in Almaty, was also killed by the communists. So not a very good way to develop your human capital. Nevertheless, by the time the Soviet Union collapsed, good things and bad things happened. The bad thing is the testing ground of Semipalatinsk that poisoned the atmosphere and the waters and caused cancer in tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Kazakhs. And then the oil development came. First, the Soviet-era oil development that became later Tengiz, the huge oil field that American capital came in, and then Kashagan, Karachaganak, and others, some of the largest fields in the world, some of them are very expensive fields in the world, but we're not stopping there. Beyond oil and gas and the pipelines, and first it was, I mentioned, the Soviet capital, then Soviet development, then the American capital, and then the Chinese came in force since the second half of the 90s, winning almost every bid for every oil and gas field in Turkmenistan, in Kazakhstan, in Uzbekistan, etc. So it is a much more comprehensive development now with ports, airports, something called a dry port. It's like a port, but it's on land, shipping goods from China, mostly from China West. And then, in addition to East-West development, North-South development, extremely important to landlocked country like Kazakhstan, or a doubly landlocked country like Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan you hear about in the news a lot. They are in an early stage of massive economic development. So looking beyond brick and mortar, we're examining in the report Also, two very important things, sine qua non, without which you cannot have this development. One is what Dan referred to as soft infrastructure. Laws, regulations, an important thing in that part of the world, compatibility of customs regulation. If you don't move things through the customs quickly, it will be less competitive. And then human capital, of course, and also IT, high-tech, renewable energy. It's a step in Kazakhstan with a lot of wind blowing, so you can have a lot of wind energy. And toward the south, in the desert, there are tons and tons of acreage where you can put solar. If you take out hydro, and hydro is massive, especially in mountainous republics like Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan, and there's some big projects now. The Narin Cascade, what is it, 40 years took them to finish it to the current point. It's a massive project of hydro, but if you take out hydro from the equation, it's between 1% and 3% of renewable. President Nazarbayev says, let's push the renewable towards 2050 and have 50% of the renewables. And whereas in 2012, I led a project on evaluating Kazakhstan's energy mix, and at that time, we came to the conclusion that it's probably too early to move into the renewables in a massive manner. I said, learn the technology, develop the legal infrastructure, educate your policymakers and your engineers. Today, as the prices are going down in solar and wind, I'm saying push the renewable. I think President Nazarbayev is right. And you don't want your coal, for example, to be the polluting 70% of Kazakhstan's energy is coal. You don't want to be a big polluting nation. You want to be the clean nation. And Kazakhstan, of course, also has huge supplies of uranium. Kazatomprom, who mentioned AIFC, the Astana International Financial Center, Kazatomprom just floated its equity in Astana, at the financial center, and in London, and what was it, $500 million they got? Like that. About 15% of equity, and they can raise more as long as the supply is not flooding the market and prices are reasonably high and competitive. So we intend next year, God willing, to work on soft infrastructure for economic growth and institutional reform in Central Asia. We would also like to work on security requirements for economic growth, looking at things like the threat of radical Islam, the friction between the United States on one hand and Russia and China on the other hand. We would like to see how Central Asian countries can cooperate together in providing security solutions, including Afghanistan. As Mikhail Gorbachev 30 years ago referred to it as a bleeding wound, it is unfortunately still a bleeding wound. It shows how prescient Gorbachev was. I want to conclude with a quick discussion in the report. I encourage you to read the report or download it from the website. The availability of finance. Dan is right. It is not only a China game, and we should not either over-securitize the Chinese finance or get scared of it. We need to get competitive. We have a gentleman here from former OPEC and now U.S. International Investment.
Still OPEC.
Still OPEC.
Yeah.
But will be the U.S. International Investment Agency?
United States International Finance Development Agency.
Finance Development Agency.
Yes.
With recapitalization going up to 60 billion.
Yes.
And when you look at the Chinese approach, questions are raised correctly in my mind about transparency, about economic efficiency, about debt to GDP ratio. There are negative reactions that we see around the Indian Ocean, from Malaysia to Burma to Sri Lanka, etc. So taking that into account, why not compete with China in financing better, more transparent, more economically efficient projects. From Georgia, the port of Nakhla is U.S. finance, all the way to Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And to conclude, my sort of hobby horse, the quality of human capital will be absolutely paramount. That and transparency and anti-corruption and the rule of law. As long as a country such as Kazakhstan, which is a leader in the region, can address these two issues, and we heard about Balashak. I meet people from Balashak all the time. They're world-class, super caliber people. And the rule of law and transparency with the appearance of the court and the AIFC that is based on British law with English language and English jurists actually being the judges, including Chief Lord Justice Wolf being there. This is a major, major step forward, and I think, based on our report, taking into account the limitations probably on the micro level. The macro picture is pretty bright. On the micro level, there are challenges, but overall, the future is bright. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ariel. Can we pass the parole to Kenneth?
Thank you.
Does someone know how to, I want to make sure that I'm operating it correctly.
The slides.
So you want to have a slide? Oh, she's coming in. Hi, help with the slides, please.
Just next to Ariel.
Thank you. And which,
Come back.
Should we
Take
do one?
advantage of these slides.
And then back this way.
okay, great, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Kenneth Angell. I'm the Managing Director for Project Finance at the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon. I want to tell you a little bit about what OPIC is, what is OPIC's programs that it's been in Central Asia, and particularly in the area of infrastructure, and a preview of coming attractions. I've been at OPIC for about 25 years, and roughly 15 of those years have been working in Central Asia with great pleasure. So first, a little bit about OPIC. OPIC is the U.S. government's development finance institution. We assist U.S. companies that want to invest overseas, and everything that is highlighted in blue is where OPIC operates. Except, yes, that's where we're open. So there are three products that OPIC offers. It is debt finance, political risk insurance, and investment funds. So debt finance, it's loans, loan guarantees to overseas business ventures. It is limited recourse long-term financing, so either project finance or corporate finance to those private sector commercial projects. Political risk insurance is for to be able to protect U.S. investors and contractors against currency inconvertibility, expropriation, and political violence, including terrorism and business loss coverage. And then investment funds, which OPIC provides debt capital to support privately owned, privately managed funds that make equity investments in overseas companies. And these funds are either geographic or sector focus. Currently, OPIC's investment priorities are lumped into three areas. There's a real focus on development, so how does it benefit the country? We want to make sure that the projects have strong developmental benefits. National security priority, so particularly under this current administration, to support investment in countries that are important to U.S. foreign policy interests. And third is women, or the 2X initiative, and this is to create economic opportunities for women by partnering with the private sector to provide access to finance and access to Oh yes, higher paying jobs so that women are not just stuck running sewing machines, but being able to having the opportunity to rise up into to management. OPIC and infrastructure projects. So with apologies for Ariel, I look at infrastructure really as four categories rather than just the two. So I guess Ariel and James, yes, you've got the hard roads, ports, airports, pipelines, telecommunications, and renewable energy. I am currently looking at financing two projects in the country of Georgia. These are all projects, by the way, that OPIC finances elsewhere in the world. There's very little in the area of hard financing, hard infrastructure that OPIC has done in Central Asia. Ancillary, these would be cold storage, warehouse, logistics. Again, all of these are financed in various countries in the area. Cold storage, I know, for example, in Afghanistan. Social, this is something that I think is very important in what you refer to as quality of not only human capital, but quality of living. Schools and universities, first and foremost. Hospitals, hotels, housing. So that's the social. And then other category that I couldn't figure out really what to put them all in would be those things such as office buildings and shopping centers. So all of these are different, where OPIC has been involved with different infrastructure projects. Now, let's take a look at what OPIC has done in Central Asia. And here's a slide that I can now answer the question that Ariel asked me. So currently, we've got $54 million, but you can see historically over $1 billion has gone into Central Asia. We have a pipeline of 265 million, but the capacity is 5 billion that we're prepared to be able to provide financing and political risk insurance and investment funds in those in the 5 countries of Central Asia. And now just a quick snapshot of Kazakhstan. This is by going by what has historically been the largest amount of historical exposure that OPIC has had. So 527 million, and you can see that's oil and gas, healthcare, financial sector, microfinance, nonprofit. Currently, 14.8. So a lot of room to grow, but there's a pipeline of $30 million. We signed an agreement, a memorandum of cooperation with the Kazakh Invest early this year. I think that it was March, if I'm not mistaken. And we did the first project this year since that agreement was signed, and it was with a financial institution. And we look forward for other projects and working with Kazakh Invest. Kyrgyzstan, next, was historically $321 million with 7 projects. It currently has 4 million that is current exposure. Uzbekistan, 231 million and 10 projects in mining, tourism, telecom, education, but currently less than 1 million. The pipeline is 200 million, and part of that comes from following the memorandum of cooperation that we signed with Kazakh Invest. The Uzbek picked up a lesson, and they also asked for a memorandum of cooperation, and that was signed, I believe, in July of this year. Tajikistan has historically $40 million with 10 projects, and in the sectors of microfinance, education, nonprofit, and agriculture. It's currently $35 million, and a lot of that is in education. Turkmenistan, we have no exposure, and we have nothing in the pipeline. So, just a quick snapshot of some of the projects. So, here's an example of education. This is where Tajikistan has most of its exposure. It's the University of Central Asia in Korok. Next, the American University of Central Asia in Kyrgyzstan. This was, again, both of these education programs were involved financing to be able to, in the first one to be able to establish it, and the second one to be able to expand it. Next, here's an example of political risk finance. So, OPIC was involved by providing political risk finance to Hyatt to be able to for the hotel in Kyrgyzstan. And then the last one, just to show, this is Malaika Hotels. This is a chain that they've got 7 hotels, and OPIC provided both political risk insurance and finance for hotels in Tashkent, Bukhara, and Khiva. So, preview of coming attractions. OPIC, a year from now, OPIC will no longer exist. OPIC is going to be replaced by the United States International Development Finance Corporation. It was signed into law by President Trump on October 5th of this year. It's a new federal agency to help address development challenges and foreign policy priorities. It consolidates OPIC and USAID's Development Credit Authority. So the new authorities will include what OPIC currently does, which is loans, loan guarantees, political risk insurance, and investment funds. The new parts that we're able to do would be equity authority for limited investments, technical assistance and feasibility studies, local currency lending. It will double the budget for development finance from currently $29 billion to $60 billion. It prioritizes projects in low income and low middle income countries. There's a U.S. nexus that at the moment there has to be a 25% U.S. nexus. That will go away from a requirement down to more of a preference to sort of see. So a great deal of, it's a great deal of latitude that is expected to be able to, and many more tools to be able to, frankly, counter the authoritarian type of financing that comes from authoritarian countries such as China. And then it's expected to start in October 1st, 2019. And so with that, I will turn over my time for the next person. Thank you.
I'm going to have slides too.
Oh,
so
they will.
just
Stay
warning you. So how do I start my presentation here? Yes. Okay. So I just push this?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting us to come here and present, and appreciate the ambassador's remarks. They're very interesting. So I'm with the United States Agency for International Development. We are the U.S. government's foreign assistance agency. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the types of activities we do. In Central Asia, we have a very large energy program. We don't do a lot of other infrastructure development, for example, in the transport sector, other than some of customs borders and non-tariff barriers for trade and transport. So I'll talk today about our large energy activities that we have going on in the region. We work across all of Asia. The estimated needs in the next 12 years are $26 trillion for investment in infrastructure across the region. It's hard to read this pie chart, but Central Asia's on there for over $550 billion of investment needed. And on the bottom, it shows that more than half of this investment will be in the power sector, which is where USAID is focusing most of its assistance in Central Asia. We have several large energy activities in Central Asia. It was referenced before about a soft infrastructure, and that's really what USAID focuses on. So it's improving the enabling environment to level the playing field and attract more private sector investment. So to help countries remove barriers to investment and create more incentives for private companies to come in. So in other words, to reduce some of the risks that they might face entering. We have two large existing energy activities. One is called Energy Links, and under that we have support for a very large transmission line project called CASA 1000. This is the Central Asia, South Asia connectivity project for electricity. It's connecting Kyrgyzstan, or the Kyrgyz Republic, and Tajikistan with Afghanistan and Pakistan. So it is trading surplus power, which is seasonal, and I'll talk about it a bit more, surplus hydro during summer months when that power is available. And then the other activity we have is called Power the Future. This is primarily scaling up renewable energy in the region, and I'll talk about some of the work we're doing in Kazakhstan. But it also includes a new activity, which we're just launching this year, called CARM. That's a Central Asia regional electricity market. And I'll discuss that a bit more as well. So first, to start with CASA 1000, this activity was launched 4 or 5 years ago. It is a World Bank funded project. USAID runs the secretariat out of our mission in Almaty. This secretariat helps convene the 4 countries that I mentioned earlier, and helps bring them together to look at the types of procurements needed for converter stations, transmission lines, and the idea is that this will exchange 1,300 megawatts of hydropower, where the demand is mostly in Pakistan for this power. So we've already awarded tenders. The International Finance Corporation under the World Bank has awarded those tenders, and we're assisting with the procurement of those. To do a 750 kilometer transmission lines, as well as these substations and converter stations, which I mentioned. The total cost of this project is about 1.2 billion. And in addition to the World Bank, the Islamic Development Bank and other donors like DFID from the UK have been supporting this effort as well. So it's quite a large joint project across a number of countries and a number of donors and banks. I'll now move to our Power the Future project, which I mentioned is scaling up renewables. This soft infrastructure support, which has been mentioned, is really to help with getting better policies, plans, regulations, laws in place that will help facilitate more energy development in the region. So it works on mostly energy generation as well as grid integration. So learning, and teaching grid operators how to deal with variable renewable energy resources. So when the wind is blowing, it's not blowing, the sun's shining, it's not shining, how do they deal with those fluctuations in the grid when they're used to base load coal or hydropower plants, which can run flat out continuously. So it does take some adjustment for the grid operators, and as well as some of the competitive procurement, which I mentioned. There's a lot of words on this slide, but basically this is a little case story of the renewable energy auctions which took place this year in Kazakhstan. There was one in the spring and one in the fall, and it was a very successful program. There was a total of 858 megawatts which were awarded, the rights awarded through these auctions. And bidders were able to reduce prices significantly as the series of auctions have come on. It will include solar, wind, and hydropower bids. And the bidders included local companies from Kazakhstan as well as international companies from the US, France, Bulgaria, Turkey, Russia, and China. So these were transparent, open bids, which were quite new and innovative for Kazakhstan. And I think they've rapidly picked up this mechanism, and it will be quite successful for diversifying Kazakhstan's energy sector. The government of Kazakhstan is considering doing more auctions in the next year or two. And so our program worked with a number of agencies within Kazakhstan. So the Ministry of Energy, Cohen, which is the market operator, as well as Kazykhanov, which is the grid operator. And so we feel like this will be the start of hopefully more of these kind of procurements for Kazakhstan. And maybe it will spread to other countries in the region as well, which we're hopeful. And so then to move to our newest activity called CAREM. So the idea behind CAREM is to reconnect the 5 Central Asian countries' power grid. These countries were connected under the former Soviet Union, and when the Soviet Union broke up, the connectivity between the 5 countries has greatly reduced on power grid work. So we're looking at developing an actual market for this electricity, helping them do some utility and electricity sector reforms to reduce the price and improve efficiency for this sector, and increase power trade. And we're estimating that this kind of connectivity could save maybe $1 billion across a number of years for the region, because then you can get power from the most efficient, lowest cost operators in the region. So it will greatly streamline efficiency and improve energy security for the region as well. And here are some of the goals of the CAREM project, which is basically to improve reliability and efficiencies in the process. And then finally, I'll just show this grid, which is very hard to read. But this is where our CASA 1000 project is, this dotted line, which is connecting Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan with Afghanistan and Pakistan. And then the CAREM project is basically reconnecting these 5 countries' power grid. Finally, I'll just mention a new activity, which I didn't put up a slide for this, but it's called Asia Edge, and EDGE stands for Enhancing Development and Growth Through Energy. It was announced by our Secretary of State, Secretary Pompeo, and our Administrator Green in July for our new Indo-Pacific strategy. This energy work will look at connecting Southeast and South Asia, and eventually will include Central Asia as well. So we're excited to launch Asia Edge, and we're just in the process of designing those new activities for that. It could even include gas as well as our power sector work. So with that, I'll close. We have a large mission in Almaty, and so you're welcome to contact us here in Washington, or if you're out in the region, our staff in Almaty. So thank you very much.
Johannes, can I invite you?
Sure.
You can
Go up here.
any place you wish.
Thank you. I will not have any slides, so the presentation, though, or comments that I'll make are complementary to what I just heard. And by the way, many thanks to the organizers for this event and for the speakers, and Your Excellency, Mr. Ambassador, for your update. Very encouraging update, I have to say, on Kazakhstan. My presentation now, my comments are really specifically geared towards Ariel's and James's paper, which I strongly recommend you all read, and so I'm very happy to be the promoter of the paper. I think it addresses really a very important topic at just the right time. It's important because Central Asia is, after all, as the paper points out, at sort of the core of the cusp of the Eurasian integration process, or Asia-Europe economic integration process, which I actually, back in 2005, when I first looked at this, I identified as perhaps one of the key, and I still believe is one of the key economic and potentially geopolitical trends of the 21st century, this integration process of this huge supercontinent, which had not been integrated ever since the days of camel transport. Today, of course, we have modern transport, and so I sort of compare the integration process you now have ongoing in Eurasia with what happened in Europe in the 19th century, perhaps in the early 20th century, in terms of speed of transport and so on, connectivity. So the potential is huge, and I think the infrastructure investments that Ariel and James focused on in Central Asia at the core of this broader supercontinental integration process, I think, is terrific. It's also very timely because you have a new opening now in Central Asia with the opening of Uzbekistan, and focusing now from the outside, and as importantly, I believe, increasingly from the inside, of how you cooperate within this region, coordinate, and link with the rest of the world is just the right time. And I think we here sitting in Washington are very far away, but I think there is a contribution to be made from the Washington perspective also. Now, in terms of issues that the paper raises, there are a number I fully agree with, and I should perhaps say I'm currently involved in a study on the impact of BRI on Central Asia and the South Caucasus, its potential benefits and its risks that have to be managed. And so there's a lot of overlap in what the paper addresses, and a lot of clear messages that come out, aside from the message of how important Central Asia is. And by the way, a Kazakh colleague of mine has called Kazakhstan the buckle on the belt, because Kazakhstan is so centrally located. And if you look at the east-west, in particular, to some extent north-south transportation corridors, they actually mostly go through Kazakhstan. So you flag as part, especially when you talk about BRI, the debt risk and the potential benefits to the West, which, by the way, I think get underplayed too often. I think we, as you point out in your presentation today, when you listen to BRI commentary here, it's mostly negative. It's mostly stressing the risks, the downsides. Basically, to me, it sounds like the kind of critique that's been made of international foreign aid for the last 60 years. We now apply it also with a vengeance to China, which is fine, because I think there are things to worry about. But let's not go overboard and sort of see it all through a very dark lens. However, there is the debt risks, and maybe for others that I come back to. You have a very interesting list of some sort of flagship projects that are underway. I think that's very helpful, and some of them I actually didn't know about. You talk very eloquently and I think very usefully about the scope for renewables, and I was delighted to hear about USAID's program that I didn't know about. So thank you for this session today. I learned a lot. The role of ICT, I also fully agree with. You focus on the role of the private sector, which also is important. Of course, OPIC and the new, whatever it's called. DFC, whatever. Anyway, I think we'll have an important role to play. I should point out that actually the China-Europe increase in rail container traffic is basically all commercially driven. It's not government that is driving it. It's actually private sector driven. Now, governments have been helpful, but it's actually private sector driven, which shows what role the private sector can play where there are commercial opportunities. What I'm a bit worried about is that we shouldn't go overboard and think that PPPs, especially when it comes to road infrastructure, are the wave of the future. I think in the energy sector, obviously, much greater opportunities, telecoms, much greater opportunities. But in the transport sector, whether it's railroad or roads, I'm a little less optimistic that there's great potential, at least in Central Asia. You also mentioned the role of international financing, such as the multilateral development banks, now our newly created US organization, and you refer to CAREC, Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation Forum, which I actually believe has a huge potential and has already, as you point out, made huge investments. It's by now, I think, 10 countries, including the 5 Central Asian republics, who are members, but also originally six multilateral development institutions, and now it's really open, and everybody, in terms of the international assistance programs, can and does contribute in one way or another to CAREC. And I think CAREC actually could be a springboard for future regional cooperation, and maybe I can talk a bit more about that to the ambassador at some other opportunity. Now, let me close with a few comments on what I would call the dogs that didn't bark in your paper. A few of them you've actually mentioned. The two of you mentioned when you gave your presentation. It includes the soft infrastructure, which you pointed towards as being important for the future, and also transparency was mentioned as a key issue, competitiveness in procurement and so on. The whole, if you wish, the whole infrastructure of trade and transit that is really soft infrastructure, complementary to the hard infrastructure.
Next year's report.
Right, next year's report. So that dog will bark next year. Good. In addition, I would say you might at some point, or somebody might, which you didn't, but I think is an important topic, is much of the investments that one talks about are the trunk investments, the primary infrastructure investments. CASA 1000 is one example, but then also in terms of east-west road, railway connection. Well, what about secondary and tertiary? If you want this investment to be ultimately translate into economic corridors for the countries concerned, you have to invest obviously in the soft infrastructure, but in business climate and so on, but you also have to invest in the secondary and tertiary infrastructure dimension. You also have to, and frankly, if you take any message from me tonight with you, you also have to focus on operations and maintenance. It isn't mentioned once in your paper, Ariel and James. I wish you had mentioned it, because from my perspective, if you do not think about and address the operations and maintenance challenge, as you also focus on new investments, basically you're clapping with one hand. In most of the countries in the region, operations and maintenance, especially maintenance, is totally in the shambles, and it needs to be addressed as a matter of priorities. Otherwise, when you create new assets on top of the old assets which you're already not taking care of, you just end up with, in 5, 10, 20 years, with an amount of deferred maintenance, which we well know the consequences from Metro here in Washington and the bridges that collapse, including in Italy, of course. So please, 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 let's all remind each other at every corner when we talk about investment, it has to be not only new investment, it has to be also operations and maintenance. Without it, I think we're in deep trouble. Just think about the number you saw. What was it, $550 billion for Central Asia? No, $550 billion of infrastructure requirements for Central Asia. At 2% per annum, which was KPMG estimates as a minimum of maintenance, not minimum operation maintenance requirements, that translates into, my calculations, to $10 billion a year of maintenance requirements. And that's a hell of a lot of money for the region. So that is, I already mentioned transparency and accountability and competitive procurement, competitive approaches wherever possible. I also should perhaps we should caution a little bit to make sure that we actually, somebody carefully analyze the demand side here. We tend to focus on supply side, the nice corridors and so on, but has somebody actually carefully analyzed whether or not once the investment is made, there's actually going to be demand to justify this investment along potentially competing corridors. Now, there's been one good analysis by the Eurasian Development Bank on this for 2 corridors. And they come to the conclusion, no problem, Siberian Railroad Corridor and the sort of middle corridor going through Kazakhstan, east-west, are fine. There probably is enough demand. But I worry that we perhaps haven't done enough of this for all the corridors that are currently under consideration. Then, of course, there is the social and environmental impacts, including the employment impacts. China, of course, has been criticized a lot. And indeed, I think it bears careful analysis. It links back to the transparency issue, of course, because many times these issues are actually publicly criticized, but the projects are not transparently managed, and therefore these issues are never fully explored and considered. Finally, let me mention that the integration of these, let's call them BRI or other big projects into national plans and national investment programs is absolutely critical. Kazakhstan is actually a very good example here because the BRI Chinese support for your investments were very clearly integrated into your program of Norli Joel that you mentioned. And so is, I think, an excellent example for what could and should be done, but is not generally done. Finally, I think it would be very helpful if these individual investment programs in particular countries are actually integrated into regional plans, because in the end, each investment has regional implications, opportunities, and perhaps potential downsides. So linking to regional plans, regional corridor analysis, which, by the way, CAREC has done a very good job on, at least for the Central Asia region, is worth pursuing. So these are areas, Ariel, for all your future research. I wish you well. Next year's report on soft infrastructure, then the following year on tertiary, secondary, tertiary. And anyway, you've got a big work program. Please, operation maintenance. Thank you very much.
Well, we do want to turn this into an interactive discussion. Let me, in that spirit, let me lead off with the first question. Mr. Ambassador and Ariel and others, in the paper there is frequent reference to public-private partnerships. But in our discussion today, with the exception of you just raising it, there hasn't been much reference or many examples. Could you expand on the potential there a little bit, and then we'll open it up to questions that others might have.
Thank you, Ted. I think this, I can give you one example in Kazakhstan, and I think it is a very significant example. This is a circle road, or the beltway, going around Almaty city. So what is going on now? We are having a lot of tracks entering the city, and so the design was to build a beltway to avoid any track movement inside the city. So this is the best example of the PPP project that we launched a few years ago. And so the total length of this belt road, I don't remember the figures, several hundred kilometers, but the money has been attracted from the EBRD and the private sector and the public sector as well.
Private sector in Kazakhstan?
In Kazakhstan and external investors as well. So this is the biggest PPP project worth of, I would say, $500 million project, which I think is a great example, and that we believe can be a starting point for further similar projects in the region that can be implemented.
Good.
Just quickly to add, and by the way, terrific contributions by everybody, and thanks to everybody. This is a high quality discussion that you don't get every day in Washington. On PPPs, yes, it's on page 22, and we particularly single out green energy and telecoms, but the necessary condition for successful PPPs is to have the law and the implementing regulations. Otherwise, people will not feel secure to commit their funds. If you have a long-term project, pension funds and other long-term investments would come with relatively low rates of return, but they have to be absolutely secure. And how you instrumentalize it, do you float a bond? Does the government give a guarantee? These are the specifics that can be negotiated. But yes, absolutely, there is space and necessity to bring public-private partnerships to Central Asia.
All right. Just to make this real, the next time you go to Dulles Airport, you will find that the Dulles Toll Road is owned by the Australians. So if you see a pothole, go to the ambassador of Australia. Tell him to fill it in.
Is it McCrary? McCrary, the company?
I can look that up, but I'm not
Probably.
exactly sure. Ladies and gentlemen, questions? Yes, sir.
I just wish to find out what the current and planned use for the Expo 17 Buildings and site is right now in the future.
Yeah, Expo 2017 was a very big project for Kazakhstan, and you know that the Expo lasted for four months. We have had about 5 million visitors. You know that all Expos started with in 1851 with the famous Crystal Pavilion in London at the Hyde Park, and before we started to build the Expo site, we well thought the post-use of the Expo site, and one of the major ideas were to establish on the side of the Expo International Financial Center. So the 80% of the territory of the former Expo site is given to the International Financial Center. We also have a center for renewables, and that is another interesting institution that having 115 countries participating in Expo 2017, we created a committee carefully choosing the best projects, the most advanced projects. So we chose 150 projects that has been exposed at this Expo event, and now we're trying to further develop those projects through this separate renewable agency that has been established. You know that the theme of the Expo 2017 was future energy. It's all about the renewable energy. Thank you.
Ambassador, that may be the first of its kind legacy from an expo that you're basically perpetuating the theme via with seeking commercially viable ventures at the same site. Questions, comments? Yes, sir.
I guess one thing that also wasn't discussed were the Kazakh institutions involved, and I think about some of these projects. Kazakh Railways is a major player. I'm not sure what's happening now with Samruk Kazina. I'm sure in the energy sector there are major sort of Kazakh institutions that are driving some of this growth and investment. Can the panel comment on some of these and what their role is?
Well, you know that Samruk Kazina is National Welfare Fund. We copied this concept from Singaporean Temasek fund, and Samruk Kazina these days represents about 60% of GDP of the country. And I said in my introductory remarks that following the demand of the OECD, we are trying to leave in the hands of the government only 15%, so selling the share of the big national companies that constitutes the core of Samruk Kazina fund. And National Railroad Company is one of the biggest companies in the country, and which is also being privatized, and they are not only dealing with the railroads, but they are also working on warehouses, dry ports, all other infrastructure projects, including the famous projects that has been referred to by I guess Ted when said about the GE locomotives and Alstom locomotives plants that has been built in Kazakhstan. And we're already producing a good number of locomotives that are being sold around the region. They are being purchased by Uzbeks, Azeris, and others. And we even have plans to sell locomotives to Ukraine.
And also, I didn't realize locomotive transportation is very software heavy. I didn't realize that, but a lot of software is needed to do high-speed rail.
Just to add about Samruk Kazina, this is a national holding fund And next year, you already mentioned the railroads. Kaztelecom is going to be privatized, and Erzhan is going to be privatized. And beyond that, other holdings from Kazmunaygas, which is huge. This is the national oil and gas company. And using the platform of AIFC, you see how Kazakhstan is transitioning from being a resource-intensive economy, adding value from natural resource development, oil, gas, uranium, to financial services economy that is a whole different new ball game with a high added value coming from human capital essentially doing the work at that capital market.
Other questions? Yes, yes, sir.
Hello, thank you.
Could you introduce yourself?
Of course. Hello, thank you for being here. My name is Samuel. I'm an undergraduate in the School of Foreign Service, and forgive any of my ignorances as my studies of Central Asia and Kazakhstan in particular have only just begun. I was wondering more specifically how you think the recent convention on the legal status of the Caspian Sea and also potentially the reinstatement of the Iran-US sanctions might affect these initiatives, these diversification efforts, and also perhaps the economy as a whole of Kazakhstan. Thank you.
I guess it's a question to me. Yeah.
That's right.
Yes, we August this year, 5 literal countries signed a Caspian Legal Status Convention that has been negotiated for the last 25 years. So finally, we reached an agreement on the Caspian legal status, but what it entails the 10 miles of national zone, 12 miles of economic zone, and the rest is the neutral waters. It also says that Caspian is a zone of peace, and there is no any presence allowed of military presence of third countries in the region, and you know that there has been an agreement reached that those countries willing to build Caspian pipelines can do so. There were some reservations in the past from Iranians and Russians, but not anymore. But what is important to mention that this is only about the Caspian biomass. We are not touching seabed. What is happening now? We think that the seabed demarcation and delimitation will be further negotiated. We so far managed to agree on seabed demarcation between Russia and Kazakhstan, and we also agreed on that with Azerbaijan. And there is no agreement between Azerbaijan and Iran. There is no agreement between Turkmenistan, Iran, and Azerbaijan. So the northern Caspian is more or less fine, but the southern Caspian is not with this respect. But the achievement is very significant. The Convention on Legal Status of the Caspian Sea is a huge step forward, opening the way for further discussion. Kazakhstan possesses the longest seashore area of the Caspian Sea, and we believe that the Caspian is a very fragile inland sea with a very fragile ecosystem, and that has to be preserved. You know that there is a lot of oil exploration taking place in that offshore and onshore, so I think that only united with the other 5 littoral countries, with all the 5 littoral states, we can preserve this basin. On sanctions, yes, there are 2 sanctions. One sanctions against Iran, the other sanctions are against Russia. We don't have a direct border with Iran, only through the Caspian Sea. But what I would like to say that yes, we experienced some impact of those sanctions. We call it secondary sanctions. But during the visit of my president to Washington, 2 leaders agreed on one important issue, that the current administration will do everything to avoid any unintended consequences on Kazakhstan economy vis-a-vis sanctions.
Other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
As FC Fund, I'd like to ask you to elucidate the participation sort of situation Turkmenistan is in with regard to this region, and how much integrated they can be. I believe there's some figures there were outstanding. Thank you.
It's about Turkmenistan, Ariel.
Go ahead.
I
You're the foreign minister.
I represent Kazakhstan.
So we have a volunteer.
I'm not an expert on Turkmenistan, but I've worked for a few years in the region. So Turkmenistan is, of course, an interesting case because it has its very strict neutrality provision, as you probably know, which basically is used as an excuse or a rationale for not joining multilateral development and regional efforts in general. However, on specific projects, of course, there's been Turkmenistan has been much engaged in gas pipelines through towards China, in particular to Iran, and so on. And indeed, as a pipeline envisaged and should be finished, they sort of said, although I don't believe by 2020, TAPI from Turkmenistan all the way to India through Afghanistan and Pakistan. In addition, actually, Turkmenistan, and is perhaps one of the very few cases, Turkmenistan has joined CAREC, the Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation Forum, which is one of the reasons why I feel CAREC actually should be pursued a bit more forcefully. It's unfortunately, if you wish, an externally driven, so far it's been an externally driven enterprise. Basically, Asian Development Bank has been driving it, and it hasn't really reached the top political consciousness in the countries concerned, basically ministerial, sub-ministerial level, but it's got real potential, I believe. So Turkmenistan is in there. Turkmenistan is, however, a difficult partner in many ways and has always been. So we'll have to see how it develops. Well, fortunately, one perhaps can say it isn't as important, anywhere near as important to regional integration cooperation as Uzbekistan is. And I think the great news about Central Asia today, the last 12 months, is that Uzbekistan has opened up and is now ready, it seems, to integrate more generally. That may indirectly also put pressure on Turkmenistan, and so I think one can be hopeful that perhaps in the longer term, Turkmenistan will also join up.
And I would like to add that these days Turkmenistan is chairing the Ariel Saving Fund that brings together 5 Central Asian countries. And one of the recent summits of the Ariel Saving Fund took place in Turkmenistan, in Turkmenbashi, where the 5 leaders of Central Asia got together and they had the chance to talk not only about the destiny of the Ariel Sea, but also about the regional integration.
If you're a supplier of a commodity, and in case of Turkmenistan, of course, it's natural gas, you want more than one market. Turkmenistan historically sold its gas to Russia and Iran. However, Russia has plenty of gas, a lot of gas that it doesn't sell all of it to Europe. Iran doesn't have the money to pay for Turkmen gas, and the poor Turkmen still pumping that gas. To the Iranians, I had a conversation with a high-level official and said, oh, you know, these are neighbors, and neighbors don't do nasty things to neighbors, etc., etc. The bottom line is they need a pipeline, and that would be a pretty short pipeline, from their territorial waters into Azerbaijan, connecting to the main export pipeline, the one that the top Tanap pipeline to Turkey and to Europe. And they haven't done that yet. They're afraid of the Iranians. The Russians stopped buying their gas. I mentioned that. Iranians are not paying. So the only market they have is the Chinese market. The moment they build this interconnector, which is, I think it's 120 kilometers that they need to build to connect to the Azeri territorial waters, to Azeri pipeline system, the Chinese will start paying them more because there'll be competition. And we've seen that with Gazprom in Europe, etc., etc. So the market imperative for Turkmenistan is to diversify the direction of their pipelines. You mentioned TAPI. I've written a paper on TAPI in 2006 with Lisa Curtis, who's a senior director now at the National Security Council. We then said that it doesn't look very good, although it's a good idea. it still has not been built because of the terrible security situation in Afghanistan. So God willing, one day the security will calm down. They will be able to export their gas, not just to China, but also to Pakistan, Afghanistan. Well, Afghanistan has its own gas. Pakistan and India.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, interview some formally from the World Bank. My question is generic. I haven't had the opportunity to read the paper, which I look forward to doing. Just wanted to know how does climate change, or does climate change factor into your infrastructure development, the futuristic programs and so on, given the climate change agreement recently in Buenos Aires and of course in Paris. So how, I can give a very quick example of something happening in Sri Lanka. It's an island nation, and we talked about Chinese investments and so on. We have a very big waterfront project going on, completely financed by China. And part of the areas under this waterfront project are low-lying. And government is going forward with it, and several controversies abound. But that's, with sea level rise, that area is going to be submerged, is what many scientists say. So just wondered how much these kinds of issues might be incorporated into the infrastructure portfolio in Central Asia.
Would USAID take the lead on energy and emissions?
So we do have programs at USAID in resilience, where we are looking at protecting infrastructure development, anticipating changes in the climate. That could be water flows for dam construction. So, for example, normally historical water flows have been used to estimate a dam's capacity, but with climate change, if there are reduced water flows expected, then a lot of those dams may be underperforming, and we already see that in some countries like Nepal. In addition, where we're building infrastructure, we are concerned, aid doesn't construct a lot, but we do sometimes build some maybe schools, health clinics, small structures, and we are looking at our own infrastructure of where we're locating it. So we have a whole climate risk management program, which has been authorized, that we're mandated to do that now. All U.S. government agencies, in fact, are required to do that. So internally, certainly we are looking at it. Externally, I would say really what we're looking more at focusing on is adaptation now. So for countries to help them adjust to some of the anticipated or even current impacts that they're already experiencing. So in addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, of course, we have also been looking at expanding some of our programs in air quality or reduced air pollution and the co-benefits of reduced climate change as well. So we're tackling it, I would say, from a number of fronts, but I'm sure much more can be done. Yeah.
Jayne has just revealed herself to be a member of the dark government that is going against the wishes of her president.
Yeah, I would like to.
That's not true.
Don't even laugh like that.
Well, the biggest challenge vis-a-vis climate change in the region is the disappearing glaciers. I mean, this is the issue that we are facing, unfortunately, especially two big countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. We are downstream countries. We heavily depend on transboundary water resources. You know that Kazakhstan has only 60% of its own water resources, 40% comes from neighboring countries, including China, by the way. And so the disappearing glaciers is of great concern to the region, and I think we are paying more and more attention to that problem.
And I would add to that, USAID has done a fair amount of research into glacier retreat and ice melt, snow and ice pack. In addition, looking at some of the headwaters of these high mountain areas, which are also snow leopard habitat and other endangered species, and looking at the links between water, energy, and habitat issues as well. And we have a program in our mission in Almaty called Smart Waters, which looks at trying some of these transboundary water issues in Central Asia.
I think Johannes said 2 fingers on emissions, no?
Just very briefly, BRI, the programs we've reviewed so far in the countries concerned, have not yet integrated any considerations, as best we can tell, of climate change. Indeed, they finance in Kyrgyzstan and in Tajikistan coal-fired plants that probably are going in the wrong direction. So one of the conclusions would be that countries themselves, but also China, ought to be much more explicitly considering climate change. But I can also, by the way, turn around the question to you in the World Bank. You funded huge amounts of infrastructure in Kazakhstan and other countries in the region. So what is your integration? That's a separate conversation.
Remember the 200 billion the bank is committing now.
Right. I want to pick up on what you just said, which has to do with BRI. I think with the Chinese, as was mentioned in the report, certainly there's the debt trap that is talked about. But I think it's also important to take a look at the lack of regulations that they have towards environment, for example. The World Bank has argued that the Chinese investment had concentrated in poor nations with weak environmental regulations, leading to the creation of pollution havens. And so very often it's not just with the Chinese, it's the regulations as far as the environment, worker rights, jobs, I think, is another aspect that was mentioned, is that the Chinese are very happy to come in and provide the project, as we've seen in other countries, particularly in Africa, where they say, we will build it all for you. And then they bring in the workers all to be able to do that. So I think that it's not just a question of what it is that you're able to get the inexpensive financing. So I speak on behalf of all of the international financial institutions, so for EBRD, IFC, for Asian Development Bank, for OPEC, we require each of the projects. We look at it to make sure that it is, first and foremost, that it is economically viable. Second, that we look at what is the environmental. Third, we take a look at what are the other policies, such as worker rights, safety, that goes into it. And fourth, we take a look at what are the developmental benefits. So for the international financial institutions, we look at, there's 2 hats. There's the credit, that's very simple. It's a loan. The other aspect is we look at these policies, such as environment, worker rights, and health and safety. These are aspects that are very important for all the IFIs. So looking at it just on maybe you can get a less expensive loan from, or better terms in that sense from the Chinese, but you have to look at the whole package. And I add one other thing that I think you talked about, Johannes, which has to do with, I'm sorry, just escaped my memory, but it'll come back to me later on, that also with the Chinese, that, the operations and maintenance. Chinese are very happy to build something and then turn it over and say, it's yours, you're responsible for the operations and maintenance. And the country doesn't realize what that all means. And so suddenly they find themselves, again, trapped into something that they didn't realize, and it becomes, this is the white elephant, I think, of the examples that you gave. So
poorly maintained white elephant.
Exactly.
Well, yes, ma'am.
Maria Hatziola's also part of the former World Bank Mafia, and full disclosure, I'm the mother of James Grant. So very proud of it. Just to follow up on this point about environmental and social safeguards and the need to integrate those into investment programs, I think it really brings up the whole idea of harmonization across the region. And to what extent is there going to be a level playing field from one country to the next with respect to these environmental safeguards, so that you can in fact have some kind of defense mechanism against the unscrupulous financiers who are quite happy, as we mentioned, China, for example, to go in and may not have the same rigorous standards that other lenders may. And so in order to really defend against that approach, one needs to look at the institutions and the legal framework across countries to make sure that all the countries share similar kinds of environmental standards and regulations. So that would be part of your soft infrastructure for the future.
I just wanted to add to that. The current administration is extremely concerned about best value, quality, high standard infrastructure. And it is something that we're
Here
looking.
or there? Here or there?
There. I can't speak to here, but in other countries. And we're partnering or working with like-minded partners such as Japan, Australia, and others to try to raise internationally standards, not just the Chinese, but could be other investors as well. And this includes environment and social safeguards. And so one example of this is there's a new program this year called the Japan-U.S. Strategic Energy Partnership, JESUP is the acronym. And it's a global program, although we're focusing now mostly on Asia, which is looking at developing principles for infrastructure development so that we can all be agreed that these should be good environmental impacts statements, good mitigation of impacts, social, environment, and others. So it is something we're working internationally to try to raise those things.
I know that there are other questions and other comments, but speaking of deferred maintenance, we don't want to defer our maintenance any longer. So let's proceed informally with further conversation.
Can I just say thank you for our two interns that I see? Maybe there are others. Balash and Kabir. Any other interns? And Erin is not an intern, but she contributed greatly to the event. Thank you guys very much.
So let's get a photo of our class. Hey, Erin, can